Welcome to r/RedditRevenge. This is a story of someone getting back at someone with revenge after being wronged. And today we have 3 great stories, so subscribe, hit the like button, and let's begin. The first story. 2 executives started arguing about the weather in Denver, and I helped them with it. The second story. Man threw away my wash, so I got back at him by throwing a red sock in his wash. The third story. I was forbidden to park my car, but I found a loophole. The first story is, I get back at 2 executives at my job by pitting them against one another. I work in something of a matrix organization where one of the main executives is a guy who has made it very clear that he doesn't like me and never has. He's told me this more than once, including the day I met him and started working on the account. Anytime anything goes wrong, he tries to pin it on me. A few times he's even attempted to have me reassigned. Needless to say, I'm making the best of it while I look for another job. For this story, I'll call this guy Grumpy. So, a few weeks ago, Grumpy invites me to a meeting with him and his boss with the customer. His boss is a VP, but not of my division. I report to a different director in VP. The VP lived in Dallas. Our location is in California. I've met this guy about a dozen times over the past 2 years, but typically when I see him in the office, he doesn't even make eye contact with me, or acknowledge me in any way outside of the meetings I attend. In this particular meeting at the customer site, he extends his hand and introduces himself. This was surprising to me because of the number of times I've been in the same meetings with him when I've had to speak and have had to address him. One time I was in a meeting with him for about 4 hours, and it was just him, Grumpy, and me, so it's really odd that this guy does not recognize me. When I saw him, I called him by name and asked him how he was doing. He extends his hand and says his name, even though I already addressed him by his name. When this guy introduces himself to me, I said the first thing that came to mind, we've met, and named a few of the times we'd been in meetings in person. I figured he'd remember me, especially because of the number of times Grumpy threw me under the bus with him in person. The VP says, I knew that, but I didn't think you'd remember it, so I introduced myself again. You remembered me, but you introduced yourself because you thought I wouldn't remember? I have a bad habit of repeating things that don't make sense, as if saying them out loud will make them make sense or give the person a chance to correct me if I've heard it wrong. From there, he acted a bit snotty to me, maybe for being called out for not remembering me. After that, the customer meeting went well. Nothing went wrong, so they didn't have to blame me for it. A few days later, we had a conference call with my boss, Grumpy, and the same VP who didn't remember me. When the call started, my boss came on first. My boss is a very personable guy, and is easy to get along with. He and I said our greetings, then the VP came on. Only Grumpy was missing, but we expected him at any minute. With just 3 of us on the call, my boss says to the VP, Hey, I heard you were moving from Dallas to Denver. I already did, the VP says. That's why I was out last week. The 2 start talking about what a pain in the A it is to have to move. If there are kids, you have to deal with the schools and loss of friends and all that. Then my boss went through a few things about the differences between living in Dallas and living in Denver, like the traffic and the economy and the food. I think the difference in weather would be the most noticeable to me, I said. This was the first I'd said about the differences. I really should have just kept my mouth shut, knowing how the VP is. No, not really, the VP says. It's essentially the same thing. I paused, giving it some thought. The weather in Dallas is essentially the same as it is in Denver? There I was, repeating things again. Pretty much, he says. If you look at the range, they're almost exactly the same. Is there a Denver in Texas? I wasn't trying to be funny or sound like a smarty. I was trying to figure this out. I know there's a Paris, Moscow, Cleveland, Dayton, lots of city names in Texas that sound like they're somewhere else. Denver, Colorado. The VP sounds miffed. I don't even know if there is a Denver, Texas. But the snow? I asked. I didn't know where else to take the conversation. You get snow in Dallas? Oh, you'd be surprised at how much it snows in Dallas, the VP says. At this point, I was just stumped. I'd lived in the Houston area for years. Sure, we'd get snow, but it would just be flurries and it would never stick, so I had no idea where he was coming from with saying Dallas and Denver were identical in their weather. I lived in Houston for years, I said. That's not the same thing, the VP says. The weather in Houston is a lot different from the weather in Dallas. But this made no sense to me. Houston and Dallas weather not the same. Dallas and Denver exactly the same? Not exactly, but close enough, the VP says. And yes, we get some good snow in Dallas. That's nothing compared to the snow we get, my boss adds. I was thankful for the change of focus. My boss explains that he lives in upstate New York. Last year, we got about 100 inches. That's more than 8 feet, I said. You'd never find your car, or the road. They don't get it all at the same time, the VP says. I figured that, I said, but you get a few inches and it wouldn't melt, then a few more inches and over time. It's not that bad, the VP said. So now the VP was explaining what upstate New York was like, despite never having been there. By this time I had it figured out though. No matter what I said, this guy was going to disagree with it, the same way Grumpy did anytime I said something. We got so much snow this winter that I couldn't see my backyard, my boss said. That's hardly the disappearance of cars and roads though, the VP says, attempting to refute my earlier comment. Roads? I couldn't see my barn, my boss says. I could look out my window and it was just white. But still, the VP said, that's not 8 feet all at the same time like he said before. My barn is, well, it's a barn. You know how big they are, my boss said. It was covered in snow. By now, Grumpy has joined the call. Grumpy knows his boss has moved to Denver from Dallas. He hadn't heard any of the previous conversation, but he heard the part about the snow in New York. So he adds, that's more snow than you get in Denver. Sure is, the VP says. Heck, I said, that's even more snow than they get in Dallas. My boss and I chuckle a little. What? Grumpy says, laughing too, not realizing I was making fun of the VP's previous comment about Denver and Dallas having the same weather. You think they get more snow in Dallas than they do in Denver? Still laughing. Well, maybe not more, but the same, I said, repeating what the VP had said. He hadn't exactly said that the snow there was the same, but he'd said the weather was the same, that they get a lot of snow in Dallas. Huh, Grumpy says. Have you ever been to Texas? My daughter lives in Irving. That's not Dallas, I said. I know Irving and Dallas are side by side, but I was now actively trying to make one of the two look stupid. It's the same thing, Grumpy said. I've never seen it snow in Dallas. That's not what I heard, I said. His boss had just said it snows all the time in Dallas. I knew where this was going. I heard the weather in Dallas and Denver is not exactly the same, but it's almost exactly the same. That's ridiculous, Grumpy said. If you believe the weather in Dallas and Denver is even remotely close, you're crazy. I've been to both, and let me tell you, they aren't anything alike. I didn't say I believe it, I said. I just said I'd heard it. You just moved to Denver, Grumpy says to the VP. Do you expect the icy cold weather in Denver to be the same as the scorching heat you had in Dallas? It's essentially the same thing, the VP says, sticking to his previous statement and sounding a little uncomfortable now. Well, Grumpy says to his boss, then after a little pause, you would know. You live there. If you say it's the same, I have to believe that. The backpedaling was amazing, but not the least bit surprising. From there, the conversation faded and the topic turned to work. The meeting went pretty much as expected, with nothing else that was all that unusual. Now anytime someone mentions it being cold in the office, if Grumpy's around I say, D, it's as cold as Dallas in here. The next story is, dump out my laundry, enjoy being pretty in pink. I was living in my first apartment and working a crummy fast food job. One Monday I realized I forgot to wash any of my uniforms over the weekend, with just enough time to get it done before I had to leave for my shift. The laundry room was deserted, and most of the machines were available because my shift started at 1 p.m. It was a trashy complex, so ordinarily I stayed and watched my clothes, but I figured no one would bother to steal KFC uniforms, so I walked to my unit to get a book. When I got back 5 minutes later, someone had pulled all my wet uniforms out of the washing machine and dumped them on the disgusting floor, then put a load of men's hospital scrubs in instead, stealing my 75 cents and soap. My first impulse was to reverse what the jackass did and confront him, but there was no guarantee he'd return before I had to leave for work. Instead, I wrung out my soapy laundry and carted it back home while fuming. I rinsed out a single shirt and pair of pants, then headed back to the laundry room to dry them, and brought along a special gift for Hospital D. I hadn't seen anyone wearing white scrubs in a long time, but this was nearly 30 years ago and that's what color HDs were. One of my store's managers gave the crew dollar store Christmas stockings with candy in them the previous year, and I still had mine in a drawer. They were incredibly cheaply made, and such an incandescently loud red they almost glowed. One of my coworker's boyfriends cluelessly tossed her stocking into a load of socks, turning the whole lot bright pink. Her joke at the time was that all his socks in the load became her socks, because he refused to wear them anymore. Everyone reading this figured out paragraphs ago exactly what I did with that stocking. A single polyester fast food uniform dries very quickly, so I already had it out and in a garbage bag before the wash cycle hit spin. I sat reading my book while praying to the sky HD would arrive before I had to leave, which he did shortly after the cycle ended. I pretended to read as he opened the lid and started cursing, while removing pink garment after pink garment from the machine. Halfway through unloading, he got my attention and asked if I'd seen anyone around that machine. I told him I hadn't, but that I'd only been there a few minutes. I asked him why. Was something wrong? He pointed to the Barbie pile and said, "This." I asked him what was wrong with his wife's clothes, and he said no, they were his. I affected being slightly taken aback and asked why he went with that color, to which he angrily replied that he hadn't and they were white. Having a friendly person innocently rubbing his situation in was making him madder by the second, so I told him there might have been something red left in the bottom of the machine by the last user and offered sympathy. He grunted in reply and returned to pulling scrubs out. A couple seconds later, he found the now faded and blotchy stocking and completely blew his stack. He yelled, "No, I know what effing happened," and launched into a raging tirade about what he was going to do to that effing effer. I expressed dismay at it being deliberate sabotage and left him furiously throwing scrubs into a dryer, while I walked out shaking my head that someone could do something so low. The complex had a laundry room for each cluster of buildings, and my place was equidistant from 2 of them. I switched rooms and never saw the guy again, which is a shame, because I'd have killed to see him walking or driving around in one of his beautiful new outfits. The last story is, lock me out of the free parking lot so I have to pay? F you MBTA employees, you're locked in. When I worked in Boston, I used to take the commuter rail in. There was a small lot that was not an MBTA lot, which abutted the pay $2 per day lot that the MBTA ran. For 5 years, I parked in this small lot with several other regulars, including the MBTA conductors who all wanted to save $500 to $600 per year. One day, I pull into the lot and discover that there's a padlock on the gate, which has been chained shut. I see Dave, our regular conductor for the 7:25 a.m., just clicking the lock home, and roll down my window and ask him, "Hey Dave, what gives?" New policy, only MBTA employees can park here now. The lot was small, and when we regulars parked there, some of the conductors and other sundry train people had to pay. I grumble and dig for change, which is composed of nickels and dimes left over from fast food purchases. Quarters were for tolls. On the way home, I stop at a CVS in Boston and pick up my own padlock. I get to the safe, and instead of rushing with the rest of the cattle to our cars, I confidently walk over to the gate of the little free lot, place my lock, to which only I have the keys on the chain. The conductors don't get to their cars until after the turnaround, and cursory cleanup happens. I live at the end of the line. The next morning, I see that the gate is wide open. My lock has been bolt cut and is laying on the ground under a no longer used chain. I park, conductor Dave is getting out of his car. We exchange the nod and I walk with him to the platform. Other regulars are pulling in and getting out of their cars now, along with the other MBTA folks that are there in time to snag a free spot. "So, what happened to the new policy?" I innocently asked Dave. "Too much trouble," he says. "Besides, I think the laundromat actually owns the land, and they got peeved and locked us in last night. Had to go find bolt cutters to get out." Do tell, Dave, do tell. For the next 2 years that I worked in Boston, nary a problem. Total savings, about $3,500. Screwing the MBTA, priceless. I hope you enjoyed these stories. Subscribe, hit the like button, and turn on notifications.